Hey, what is going on, guys? This is SMEB Reviews, and today I am starting a new series. A series where I'm going to take an in-depth look at albums that I've got time to sit with for years. Albums that came out years ago and I've got to hear over and over, both for the good and for the bad, and really talk about my thoughts on them. Because music journalism, while it needs to be put out in a timely manner and in order to really tell people what's important and what's not and what's worth listening to and what isn't, it still is very rushed. And I want to go back and take a look at the albums that came out a long time ago and get a chance to really go in depth in them with them because I've been able to listen to them for years. Along with that, I also kind of want to talk about stories that I have with the albums, memories that I have, the reason why some of the songs are important, and be a little more personal. So, while I am going more in depth, also a lot of these reviews may be a little more personal and a little more based on experience because my personal experience and view on life has been affected by these albums or just has been reflected through these albums. So, let's get started with the very first feature in what I'm calling Album Diaries, which is Songs of Innocence by U2. So let's get to it. All right. So, up front, I will be honest and say this is definitely the case of an album that really holds a lot of significant weight to it because of my life and just the important aspect that this album has had for a lot of different reasons. This album holds a lot of weight in my life. It's one that I absolutely love. U2 is a band that I've enjoyed for years. I've listened to almost all of their work. Probably the only things I'm missing are bonus tracks and things that weren't released in an official album. And honestly, I love U2. But that being said, despite them having some incredible albums, surprisingly, this is my favorite album from U2. I know a lot of people are at least lukewarm on it. Maybe a lot of people don't hate it, but nobody really would praise this as their favorite album. But here I am to try and defend this release. And up front, it had a really rough go because it got put on everyone's phone through iTunes because of the partnership that U2 made with Apple. I know a lot of people were upset about it. Honestly, though, I really was okay with it because it introduced me to an album that I absolutely love. So this is an album that I've actually heard since it came out in 2014. Because of that and because it was put onto my phone, probably it's a big reason why I got so much into U2 as I have. It allowed me to really experience the band and hear them at least past just their hits. So let's talk about some stories with this album. So for starters, I'm going to talk about actually when I acquired the actual vinyl that I have of this album, because how I actually was able to get it, how I got it was because at the time we had a Hastings in our town. It's basically just a mixed media sort of store where they buy and sell used and new items for video games, books, CDs, just in case nobody had one near them. Similar to a vintage stock if anyone has one of those near them. It was a store that I absolutely loved. I definitely like to support independent record stores, but none were near my area, and I didn't have access to go to a lot of record stores at the time. So it was completely impossible for me to do that. But this store had this album in it, and unfortunately, by the time that it was starting to close because it did unfortunately go out of business, I still had not picked it up. As the sales increased, I kept looking at it. I had at one point gone with my mom and was looking at it, and just I could not decide. I didn't know if I wanted it. Wanted to pick it up because it's really beat up, and at the time they had a very steep $30 price tag on it. And being as that I was not making very much, I did not have the money to just drop on this $30 album, even with the discounts. So I kept waiting and waiting, and eventually the discounts got to be enough where I thought I could probably afford it. I go that day, and it was gone. And I was upset because I was really wanting this album, but I kept hoping that I'd eventually find it. And every time I went, I kept looking, because just thinking maybe someone had picked it up and moved it. I never ended up finding it. Ends up, my mom had actually bought it, and I got it as a Christmas gift later that year. But that's how I actually got that specific vinyl. So I do have an actual story with the physical media that I have. I also really did want the record store day release. It was a very bland album cover, but honestly, it was cool and I really liked it. And in retrospect, I do wish I have it because on Discogs, it's consistently marked up to at least $120. So it would have been nice to pick up. That's a pretty steep increase in value, but it is one that I do wish I still had. Maybe one day, but right now I'm perfectly content with just my standard copy of it. So let's go a little further into this. So why does this album mean so much to me, and why do I love it so much? I feel like this is YouTube being very diverse. They really do explore a lot of different sounds here. We get some more punk sounds. In the very beginning, we've got some very slow, subtle moments with some Irish and Celtic tones throughout the album. And that's not something that they necessarily implemented a lot in their music. Despite being from that area, they never really capitalized or used a lot of that sound. But we do hear that on a song like Song for Someone. And it shows them being so diverse. Even in some of the moments where I don't feel quite work as well, it's still different and gives a very different sound for the band. One that honestly, even in my least favorite track, The Trouble, the closing track on this album, it's still a really solid song that I do enjoy. It just doesn't necessarily stand out as much, especially for a closing track. It's fairly tepid and doesn't do too much. Now, whenever I was first getting into this album, there definitely were some standout tracks for me. Songs like The Miracle of Joey Ramone, Every Breaking Wave, and Volcano especially were ones that I instantly gravitated towards, as they have the strongest melody and hook throughout them, and they're definitely some of the more catchy songs. It makes sense to me why a lot of those stood out, and while like The Miracle of Joey Ramone is not my favorite song or even near the top on this album anymore, it still is a solid, more punk-leaning track, which really does kind of reminisce with their roots in some of their early albums. Every Breaking Wave has one of the most beautiful instrumentals, in my opinion. Couple that with Bono's voice, which I've always loved, but on this song, it really works. The instrumentals are serene and beautiful throughout. And then we have Volcano, a track that actually inspired me to want to play bass, an instrument that, I'll admit, 5 years later, still have not played, but it is something that if I ever do have a friend or a chance to play a bass, I do like to try to pick it up and mess around with it, because it is an instrument that I'd love to learn sometime. But that was the song that got me into it, of all songs. It starts off with a great bass line. It's not advanced, it's not complicated, and there's definitely better bass work, but it's so catchy. It gets stuck in your head with how thick the bass sounds. And I absolutely love it. It really is what inspired me to want to play the instrument, and I hope that one day I will really get to dive into it. As my taste on this album progressed, I eventually discovered a lot more depth through some of these songs, both lyrically and just musically, because songs that probably wouldn't have stood out to me at a younger age at the time definitely grew on me. Cedarwood Road's a fairly mid-tempo song that's catchy, but it doesn't necessarily scream a song that you just want to put on repeat. But as I got older, I really started to appreciate the small details through this song. It shows Bono really reminiscing on just his childhood and missing it, and the street that he used to live on. And that's a thing that we hear a lot in this album. Just a lot of very reminiscing about old times, and it does capitalize on the title, Songs of Innocence. It's talking about being a child. It's talking about that young naivety, and it's such a great song. I love Cedarwood Road. Very catchy. One that's recently especially really got in my head. I've listened to it a ton recently. And then we have one of my favorite songs of all time, which I mentioned a little earlier, Song for Someone. It's an absolutely beautiful song. It does have some personal significance to me, which I don't really think I'm going to get into on camera, but it is one that has held so much weight in my life, has really inspired some of my actions, and kept me going through some times that were very difficult for me. It's a beautiful song, beautiful sentiment, and though I'll admit my interpretation of the song is probably a lot different than what they originally wrote it to be, it is a beautiful song nonetheless and very excellently written. I'm so glad that it's one that they don't cut in their live show. It is great. And for that matter, so is Cedarwood Road. I saw it also live, and it was a great song live. They are a great live band. But I am totally going on a tangent. This album has so many little elements to it. Even the songs that you just don't really think about quite as often are still solid. They have great hooks, great instrumentation, and the production here is solid, which you wouldn't expect anything less from a U2 album. Honestly, I'll admit I don't feel like I see most of the criticisms of this album. A lot of people initially wrote this off just because it was put on their phone without any form of permission, which, I mean, I understand the complaint, and I know it was sometimes difficult for people to get it off. But as someone who was actually really excited and really trying to get into music or when it was coming out and really dive deeper than I already had, this was a very welcome thing for me. And also, I could see a lot of complaints about possibly the lyrical context. It is a fairly weak lyrically album. It has good moments, but unless you really read between the lines, sometimes it just kind of comes off as vague. And I can absolutely see that. Now, for me personally, I am able to hear each of these songs and draw a perfect narrative from it just because I've listened to them so many times and really thought about each of these songs. But that doesn't mean that that this is what they were intended. They are fairly vague at times, and some of them, like "Miracle of Joey Ramone," despite being a very catchy song, is definitely not one that just stands out lyrically because it's just about being inspired by Joey Ramone and the Ramones, and it doesn't have a lot of real emotional weight, but you can hear the influence and you can see that they were very moved by the work of the Ramones, and I feel like they really just capture the total childlike wonder in this album. Yeah, it's not super, it doesn't go super in depth. It doesn't really dig deep or really deal with too many super emotional feelings and thoughts. But it's fun when it needs to be fun. And it deals with emotions in a very childlike way, not to show some form of lack of understanding, but rather to look at it through the eyes of a child who has a much more simplistic view on life. I think it's a really respectable thing, and they really drove it home. They absolutely stuck with the concept here, and I think that it was a great, great showing that they did. So, I'm going to try to wrap up this review with one final story, one final fun tidbit about this album, in that this is actually the album that inspired me to start YouTube. I almost even forgot to mention it because for a while I forgot that that's what made me start. I was listening to this album, I was totally inspired by it. I loved every moment of it, but yet a lot of people were very critical of it, and I was like, hey, I want to throw my hat in the ring and try to give my opinion on albums, give a different point of view, and it's actually is what inspired me to start it back in May 2017, and we've been going for over 2 years. Again, thank you guys for all staying with this channel. I love this album. I think it's nearly perfect. I want to give it a 10 out of 10 so bad, but the fact that I've never given one kind of holds me up, not because I'm afraid to give one, but I feel like there's just always something that's going to be better, and while that this is so very close to perfect, and even some of the albums I've reviewed in the past, there is a specific album that I do consider probably a 10. That being said, I feel like this one's very close, but does not quite touch it because there is always going to be something better. There are albums I do consider 10, though I've never actually reviewed them on this channel. So this one, very close, but it is going to get a 9.5 out of 10. What did you guys think of this new series that I'm starting? Also this album, but more importantly, I do want to hear your thoughts on this series, what you think about it, how I can improve it. I'd really love some feedback because it was something that I was considering for a long time. I really wanted to talk about this album because, as I said, it's what made me want to start YouTube. So if you guys can give me any feedback for future episodes of this, if it's even something you want me to continue where I talk a little more in-depth and a little more personally about some albums, please let me know. Besides that, thank you all so incredibly much for sticking around, watching this video, and supporting my content. I will see you all later.